Hello there. I'm your imaginary friend. And as usual, I've got some explaining to do. To start with, why is this video sponsored content? A thing that I certainly never thought we would see on this channel. So the story behind that is my very good friend, the lovely and talented Maria Kuroshchepova, has gifted with me at some point in the past a copy of a set of translations that she's done, Moonlit Tales of the Macabre, from Ukrainian and Russian original sources. Um, and that's what I'm going to be reading for you today. And yeah, if you think I'm going to go through all this and not tell you to buy my friend's book, I'm going to tell you to buy my friend's book. So, since I've received something for free that I'm focusing on in this video and telling you to buy it, that's kind of the dictionary definition and the legal definition of sponsored content, and it has to be disclosed. So that's how we came to see. I don't know what it looks like. There must be something somewhere that says this is sponsored content. I don't know where to point to, or if it shows up in the video or just in the thumbnail. No idea, because I've never done this before. But anyway, sponsored content. Please buy that woman's book. Now, this is a story by Nikolai Gogol, and as always, bear in mind that sometimes an author may have included something in their work that at the time of writing seemed fine to them. It's not always fine. But also, if you are not very familiar with Ukrainian or Russian literature, you may find that the pace of this is a little slower than you might be used to. So if that's something you don't have a great deal of patience for, don't tell Nikolai Gogol I said this, but if you skip about 10 minutes, maybe even 15 minutes, you're not going to really miss a lot of the plot. Just don't tell Nikolai. This is called V. As soon as the loud seminary bell hanging by the gates of the Brothers' Monastery in Kiev tolled in the morning, the schoolboys and seminarians rushed in from all over the city. Grammarians, rhetoricians, philosophers, and theologians shuffled to class carrying notebooks under their arms. The grammar students were mostly very young. As they walked, they shoved each other and argued in thin little duscant voices. Almost all of them were in torn, soiled clothes, and their pockets were always filled with all sorts of junk. Marbles, whistles made out of quills, half-eaten pie, and sometimes even a little sparrow. The latter often chirped in class and brought upon its protector a healthy dose of stick over both palms, or even a helping of cherry switch. The rhetoricians walked with more dignity. More often than not, their clothing was in good repair, but their faces always bore some sign of rhetorical struggle. An eye, swollen so much it was pointing up, a veritable blister for a lip, or some other bruise. These students usually spoke and cursed in tenors. The philosophers sounded lower by an entire octave, and their pockets were mostly empty, save for strong tobacco rolls. They never saved anything for later, and ate whatever they found on the spot. They smelled of pipe and vodka so powerfully a passing worker often halted and sniffed the air like a greyhound. The market was only just beginning to stir at this hour of the morning, and the peasant women selling pretzels, buns, roasted watermelon seeds, and poppy breads snatched at the coat-tails of every passer-by, be it a coat of fine fabric or some thinner material. "Gentlemen, gentlemen, over here," one of them shouted. "Here are some pretzels, some poppy buns, some crullers, and some nice bread. I swear to God they are fine, with honey. Baked them myself." Another woman raised something long and spiraling made out of dough and called out, "An icicle! Buy an icicle, gentlemen!" "Don't buy anything from her. Look how filthy she is. Her nose is all wrong, and her hands are dirty." They didn't dare bother the philosophers and the theologians, because those liked to taste things. and usually by the handful. Once at seminary, the crowd filed into low but rather spacious rooms with small windows, broad doors, and dirty benches. Each classroom suddenly filled with multi-voiced humming as the tutors listened to their students. A ringing descant of a grammar pupil matched the trembling of the glass set in one of the small windows, and the glass responded in an almost identical sound. A rhetorician sat in the corner. His big mouth and thick lips would have been more appropriate on a philosopher, at the very least. He hummed in a bass voice, and all one could make out from the distance was boo, 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 boo. As they followed the class, the tutors kept an eye on the happenings under the benches, where a bun, a varenyk, or a handful of pumpkin seed might be spilling from a student's pocket. When this entire scholarly crowd contrived to arrive early, or when they knew their teachers would be late, a battle was organized with unanimous support. Everyone was expected to participate, even the overseers who were supposed to ensure the orderly and moral behavior of the entire scholarly guild. Two theologians usually decided how the battle would take place, whether each class would stand for itself, or whether everyone would split into two halves between the bursa and the seminary. In any case, the grammarians were the first to start, and as soon as the rhetoricians joined in, the little ones ran off to observe the battle from a higher elevation. Then the philosophers, with their long black mustaches, came to take part. And finally the theologians, in their terrible Turkish pants, and with their thick necks. Usually, the theologians won over everyone else, and the philosophers, scratching their bruised sides, were forced to retreat into a classroom and rest on the benches. The professor entering the classroom was usually someone who had participated in such battles himself in the past. Within a moment, he could tell from the flushed faces of his students the battle was a fine one. And even as he applied the switch to the fingers of a rhetorician, in another classroom another professor dispensed retribution upon a philosopher with a wooden ruler. A theologian was treated quite differently. Using the professor's expression, they received a handful of peas, a number of hits with a short leather whip. On church and secular holidays, the seminary and bursa students set out to houses, staging amateur theatricals. Whenever a comedy was presented, some theologian, only a little shorter than the Kiev belfry, invariably became distinguished as Herodias or Potiphar's wife. As a reward, he received a piece of cloth, a sack of grain, half of a steamed goose, or some such. All these learned people from the seminary and the bursa alike, regardless of their innate dislike of each other, were extremely poor in means, and therefore incredibly eager to eat at all times. It would be quite an impossible task to count, for instance, how many dumplings each of them put away at dinner. In any case, the kindly charitable contributions of the wealthy citizens were never enough. When the supplies ran low, the Senate, comprising philosophers and theologians, dispatched the grammarians and rhetoricians, under the supervision of one philosopher, who sometimes took a more active part, armed with canvas sacks, to pillage other people's vegetable patches. The senators consumed so many purloined watermelons and cantaloupes, the next day the tutors had to listen to 2 lessons instead of 1, the spoken one and another one rumbling in someone's stomach, under the kind of coats worn by both bursa and by seminary, their hems stretching down to there, a technical term meaning floor length. The most celebrated time at the seminary was vacation, the time period starting in June, when bursa students were sent home. The entire great road leading out of the city became crowded with grammarians, philosophers, and theologians. Those who had no place of their own to go to went to stay with a friend. Philosophers and theologians often went off on contract, that is, to tutor the children of the wealthy, for which they were paid enough to buy a new pair of boots for the year, or sometimes even a coat. This entire assembly moved along like a gypsy camp, made porridge and slept in the fields. Everyone carried a sack with one shirt and a pair of onuchas. Theologians were usually careful and neat. To keep from wearing out their boots, they took them off. hung them on sticks, and carried them over their shoulders, especially when it was muddy. They rolled up their pants up to their knees and fearlessly splashed through the puddles in bare feet. Whenever they saw a village, they left the road, walked up to whichever house looked the neatest, and sang a psalm. The master of the house, usually some old Cossack, listened to them for some time, resting his head on both hands, then wept most sincerely, and said to his wife, "Wife, whatever these schoolboys are singing must be very smart indeed. Bring them out some lard and whatever else we have." An entire bowl of vareniki was then dumped into the sack, a respectable piece of lard, a few loaves of bread, and sometimes even a chicken. Having thus refilled their stocks, grammarians, rhetoricians, philosophers, and theologians continued their journey. The further they walked, the smaller the crowd began. Almost everyone eventually had reached their homes, and the only ones left were those whose nests were most distant. One time during such a journey, 3 Bursa scholars left the big road to restock their provisions at the nearest village, for their sack has been empty for some time. They were Kalyava the theologian, Koma Brute the philosopher, and Tiberius Gorobets the rhetorician. The theologian was a very tall, broad-shouldered man, and had a very odd temper. No matter what was left sitting near him, he would steal it. All in all, he was of a very dark temperament. Whenever he got drunk, he liked to hide in the weeds, and it took other students a long time to find him. Philosopher Koma Brute was of a cheerful disposition. He was very fond of lying about and smoking his pipe. Whenever he drank, he always hired musicians and danced. He often received the handful of peas treatment, but bore it with truly philosophical indifference, as something part of his destiny, and therefore nothing to be done about. Rhetorician Tiberius Gorobets wasn't yet old enough to have a mustache, drink vodka, or smoke the pipe. He wore his hair in a single lock at the top of his head, and his character was yet to fully develop. Judging by large bumps on his head he brought to class daily, one might suppose he would make a good warrior. Theologian Kalyava and philosopher Koma often tugged on his lock of hair as the sign of their protection of him, and used him as their deputy. It was evening when they turned off the big road. The sun had only just set, and the air was still warm. The theologian and the philosopher walked in silence, smoking their pipes. Rhetorician Tiberius Gorobets knocked the flowers off the weeds by the side of the road with a stick. The road passed between the clumps of oaks and walnuts scattered here and there through a meadow. Ravines and small mountains, green and rounded like domes, occasionally interrupted the valley. A wheat field appearing in the distance here and there told them some sort of a village would be nearby. But it's been an hour since they've passed the fields, and there was no habitation in sight. The twilight darkened the sky, and the remains of crimson light faded slowly in the west. "What the hell?" the philosopher Koma Brute said. "I thought for sure we were near a village." The theologian said nothing, looked around, then puffed on his pipe again and kept on walking. "Honest to God," the philosopher said, halting again, "I can't see a damn thing. Not a fistful's worth." "Maybe there is some kind of a village further on," the theologian said, his pipe still in his mouth. Meanwhile, it was already night-time, and a fairly dark one at that. Small clouds added to the gloom, and judging by all signs, no stars or moon would be coming. The scholars noticed they'd lost their way, and were no longer following a path. The philosopher prodded with his foot in every direction, and finally said in a halting way, "Where's the road?" The theologian pondered for a bit and said, "Yeah, it's a pretty dark night." The rhetorician stepped away and tried crawling and feeling for the road that way, but his hands only ended up poking at foxholes. All around them was a vast steppe, seemingly untraveled by anyone. The travelers made another effort to walk a bit more, but remained surrounded by the same wilderness. The philosopher tried calling out, but his voice died off and met with no response. Only a bit later there was weak moaning, akin to a wolf's howl. "Look here, what are we to do?" the philosopher said. "Well, why can't we stop and sleep in the field?" said the theologian, and reached into his pocket to get his flint and relight his pipe. But the philosopher could not agree to this. He had a habit before bed of putting away a 10-pound bit of bread and 4 pounds worth of lard. Presently he felt in his stomach an unbearable sort of loneliness. Besides, despite his cheerful temperament, the philosopher was somewhat scared of wolves. "No, Kalyava, we cannot," he said. "How can we just stretch out like dogs without any sustenance? Let's try again. Maybe we'll stumble onto some sort of a dwelling and get at least a shot of vodka before bed." At the word vodka, the theologian spat off to the side and said, "Sure thing. There's no use staying out in the field." The scholars walked on, and much to their joy heard barking in the distance. Having listened whence it came, they walked on much faster, and after a little time saw a light. "A village. Honest to God, a village," the philosopher said. His intuition served him true. In a bit they indeed saw a small settlement consisting of 2 houses sharing a yard. There was light in the windows. A dozen plum trees stuck out this way and that before the fence. Peeking through grated wooden gates, the scholars saw the yard crowded with merchants' carts. Just then stars peeked out here and there in the sky. "Come on, brothers, don't dally. We must get us a place no matter what." The 3 learned gentlemen pounded on the gates and shouted, "Open up!" The door in one of the houses creaked, and a moment later the scholars saw before them an old woman in a shearling vest. "Who is it?" she shouted with a dull cough. "Let us in for the night, Granny. We've lost our way. It's as bad out there in the open field as in an empty stomach." "What sort of people are you?" "We're decent folk. Kalyava, the theologian, Brute, the philosopher, and Gorobets, the rhetorician." "No deal," the old woman grumbled. "I've got people all over the yard, and every corner in the house is full. Where will I put you? Besides, look at you all, so big and tall. My house will fall to pieces if I try to get you in. I know all about you, philosopher and theologian. If I start taking in drunks like you, I won't have any yard left. Off with you! Off! There's no place for you." "Have mercy, Granny. How can you let good Christian souls perish for no good reason? Put us anywhere you want. If we do any sort of harm at all, why, may our arms fall off, or whatever else God wills upon us. There." The old woman seemed to soften a bit. "Fine," she said, as if thinking about it. "I'll let you in. But I'll split you up, or I won't rest if you're all together." "That's up to you. We won't argue," the scholars replied. The gates creaked, and they walked into the yard. "Say, Granny," the philosopher said, following the old woman, "what if, as they say, honest to God, my stomach feels as if someone is riding a cart across it, back and forth. We haven't had a crumb of food since morning." "Now you're pushing it," the old woman said. "I've got nothing at all. Haven't even stoked my stove today." "But we could pay for all this," the philosopher continued. "Tomorrow, in cash. Yeah," he added quietly, "and now like hell you're getting anything." Go, and be glad with what you've got. Aren't you a bunch of delicate gentlemen?" Philosopher Koma was much saddened by these words. Suddenly his nose picked up the smell of smoked fish. He glanced at the theologian's pants and saw the tail of an enormous fish sticking from his pocket. The theologian already managed to nick an entire crucian off one of the carts. As he always did this, not out of greed, but solely out of habit, and having forgotten about the crucian, was already looking for something else to filch, intending to miss nothing, not even a broken wheel. The philosopher snuck his hand into the theologian's pocket as if it was his own, and pulled out the crucian for himself. The old woman settled the scholars as follows: the rhetorician in the house, the theologian in an empty shed, and the philosopher in an also empty sheep's hovel. Once alone, the philosopher gobbled up the crucian in minutes, examined the wicker walls of the hovel, kicked away a curious pig that snuck its snout in from its own hovel next door, and rolled over on his other side to fall asleep like a log. Suddenly the low door opened, and the old woman stepped into the hovel. "What is it, Granny? What do you want?" the philosopher said. But the woman just kept walking toward him with her arms outstretched. The philosopher thought. "No way, darling. You're too old." He moved away a bit, but the old woman once again walked towards him. "Listen, Granny," the philosopher said, "it's Lent. I'm the kind of man who'd rather lose 1,000 gold pieces than fall into sin." The old woman waved her arms and tried to catch him, not saying a word. The philosopher felt frightened, especially when he noticed a strange sort of gleam in her eyes. "Granny, what's wrong with you? Go away, for God's sake," he screamed. The old woman remained silent and continued grasping at him. He jumped to his feet, intending to flee, but the old woman blocked the door, leveled her flashing eyes at him, and once again stepped toward him. The philosopher wanted to push her away, but was surprised to realize he could not raise his arms, and his legs refused to move. He was terrified to discover no sound came out of his lips. They merely moved, but there were no words. All he could hear was the beating of his heart. He watched the old woman as she walked up to him, folded his arms, pushed down his head, jumped onto his back, as quick as a cat, and struck him with a broom. He rushed out, prancing like a horse, carrying her on his shoulders. It all happened so quickly the philosopher barely knew what was going on. He grabbed his own knees, trying to keep his legs from moving. Much to his enormous surprise, they went up and down against his will and caused him to leap and run faster than a Caucasian thoroughbred. Once they passed the village and came out into a smooth ravine with a coal-black forest looming on one side, he finally said to himself, "She must be a witch." Crescent moon grew brighter in the sky. A timid midnight glow stretched easily and misted over the land like a lace coverlet. Forests, meadows, valleys, and the sky itself, everything, seemed to be sleeping with its eyes open. There wasn't a single fluttering of wind anywhere. There was something mostly warm in the nighttime freshness. Shadows from trees and bushes fell onto the sloping valleys in sharp wedges, like comets. Such was the night during which Philosopher Coma Brute ran forth with a strange rider on his back. He felt a kind of tiresome, unpleasant, and at the same time sweet sensation creeping toward his heart. He looked down and saw the grass under his feet growing seemingly deep and far, with transparent spring water above it. The grass looked like the bottom of some clear, transparent sea, visible to the very bottom. He could clearly see his reflection in it, as well as that of the old woman on his back. He saw a kind of sun shining there instead of the moon. He heard the bluebells bend and ring. He saw a river sprite swimming from the reeds, and the flash of her curving, smooth back and leg, all made of brilliance and shimmering. She turned toward him, and her face, with its light, sparkling, piercing eyes, was drawing closer to him, her gaze bursting into his soul like a song. There it was, right at the surface, then burst into sparkling laughter and moved away. She flipped to her back, and her heavenly bosom, as matte as unglazed china, glowed under that odd sun along the edges of their white, delicate circumference. Small droplets of water covered them like beads. The sprite shook and laughed in the water. Was he really seeing this or not? Was it a dream or reality? What was it? Wind or perhaps music rang and wove itself around him, moved closer, and stabbed his soul with an unbearably sweet trill. What is this? Philosopher Coma Brute thought, looking down and rushing forth as fast as he could. Sweat fell from him in streams. He felt a devilishly sweet sensation, a kind of piercing, bothersomely terrifying indulgence. He often felt as if his heart was gone altogether, and felt for it in a panic. Exhausted and confused, he started recalling every prayer he knew. He went through every incantation against evil spirits, and suddenly felt some relief. His pace became slower, and the witch's grip on his back grew weaker. The thick grass touched his feet, and he no longer saw anything strange in it. Pale crescent shone in the sky. Very well, Philosopher Koma thought to himself, and started reciting incantations out loud. Finally, as quick as lightning, he snuck out from under the old woman and jumped onto her back. The old woman ran forward in small, mincing steps, and so quickly the rider could barely catch his breath. Earth flickered beneath them. All was bright in this not quite full moonlight. Valleys were smooth, but from the great speed they flickered vaguely and haltingly before his eyes. He snatched up a branch from the side of the road and started pounding the old woman with it. She wailed like a wild beast. At first her screams were angry and menacing, but then they grew weaker, almost pleasant sounding, and more frequent. In the end, all he could hear were quiet small sounds, like the ringing of little silver bells, touching his soul. Despite himself, he wondered whether this really was the old woman. "Oh, I can't go any further," she said in exhaustion, and fell to the ground. He stood up and looked her in the eyes. Sun was rising, and golden domes of Kiev churches shone in the distance. A beautiful young woman lay before him, with an undone luxurious braid and long eyelashes. Her bare white arms were spread wide, and she moaned, her tear-filled eyes gazing skyward. Koma shook like a leaf, overcome by a strange agitation and timidity he'd never known before. He turned and ran as fast as he could. His heart beat restlessly along the way, and he could not explain this strange new feeling that possessed him. He no longer wished to go to the village, and rushed to Kiev, pondering this odd incident along the way. There were almost no students left in the city. Everyone went home, or working on contract, or working without any agreements whatsoever, because in any Ukrainian village they could find dumplings to eat, cheese, sour cream, and vareniki, the size of a hat, without having to pay a single penny for any of it. The large, rambling building housing the bursa was utterly deserted. As much as the philosopher searched in every corner, and even examined every hole and dent in the roof, he could not find a single piece of lard, or at the very least a bit of old knish, often hidden away in odd places by the students. Soon, however, the philosopher found a way to improve his lot. He walked 3 times around the local market, whistling, winked to some young widow in a yellow kerchief. She sold ribbons, shot, and wheels from her booth, and was invited the same day to eat wheat vareniki, chicken, and there's not enough time to list everything put on the table before him, set in a small clay house surrounded by a cherry orchard. The same evening the philosopher was spotted at the pub. He was stretched out on a bench, smoking his pipe as usual, and was seen throwing half a gold piece to the pub keeper. He had a pint before him. He gazed at the patron with coolly pleased eyes, and gave no more thought to his unusual adventure. Meanwhile, rumors spread all over the city that the daughter of one of the wealthiest Cossacks, whose village was 50 miles from Kiev, returned from a walk one day, all beaten up. She barely made it to her father's house, was on her deathbed, and her last wish was to have a student from Kiev read prayers for 3 days after her death, as well as her funeral mass. Namely, Koma Brute. The philosopher found out about it from the rector himself, who had summoned him to his office and ordered him to be under way with no delay, for the noble Cossack sent his people in a cart to get him. The philosopher shuddered for some unknown reason he could not explain, even to himself. A dark foreboding told him something ill was in store for him. Not knowing why, he declared he would not go. "Listen, Domine Comina," the rector said. In some cases, he addressed his students very courteously in Latin. Not a damn person is asking you whether you want to go or not. I am telling you, if you keep on being willful and acting like a wise guy, I'll have you flogged with young birch so hard you won't need to go to the bathhouse. The philosopher scratched his head a bit and walked out without another word, hoping to rely on his feet should he need to run. Deep in thought, he descended the steep staircase leading to the courtyard surrounded by poplars. He paused for a moment, hearing fairly clearly the rector's voice, giving instructions either to his housekeeper or to one of the people sent by the Cossack. Thank the master for the grits and the eggs, the rector said, and tell him as soon as the books are ready, the ones he wrote about, I'll send them right away. I've already given them to the scribe to copy. And don't forget, my dear man, to tell your master they have good fish at his village, particularly salmon, and it would be nice if he sent us some. What we have here is quite bad, and expensive, too. You, Yavtuk, give these fellows a shot of vodka, and tie down the philosopher, or else he might run off. Oh, son of a gun, the philosopher thought. How did he know? Gangly scoundrel. He went downstairs and saw a wagon he initially mistook for a bread cart. It was as deep as a furnace for curing bricks, a common enough conveyance Jewish merchants used to travel in droves from one city to another, and anywhere they could smell a fare. 6 middle-aged but still strong and healthy Cossacks were waiting for him. Their coats of fine cloth with tassels showed they belonged to an important and wealthy master. Small scars betrayed they all have been to war, and not without glory. What to do? If such is my lot, I may as well go with it, the philosopher thought to himself, and loudly addressed the Cossacks. Hello, brothers and friends. Greetings, master philosopher, some of the Cossacks replied. I'm honored to be traveling with you, and what a fine cart, he continued, climbing in. We could hire some musicians and dance in here. Yes, a fairly proportioned wagon, one of the Cossacks said, settling next to the coachman, whose head was wrapped in a turban instead of a hat, for he had lost it at the pub. The other 5 Cossacks climbed in with the philosopher and sat down on various sacks of provisions bought in the city. I'd like to know, the philosopher said, if we should load up this cart with some sort of merchandise like salt or iron wedges, how many horses would we need? Yes, the Cossack sitting up front replied after a pause. We'd need a substantial number. After such deeply satisfying answer, the Cossack felt justified to remain silent the rest of the way. The philosopher wanted very much to know more, who this Cossack was who sent for him, what he was like, what was said about his daughter, who returned home so unusually and was now on her deathbed. Her story now became connected with his own, after all. And what was their house like? He asked some questions, but the Cossacks too must have been philosophers, for they said nothing and only smoked their pipes while sprawled on the sacks. Only once did someone address the coachman with a brief order. Keep your eye out, Overko, you old gawk. When you pull up to the pub on the Chekrylovskaya road, don't forget to stop and wake me up. Wake up the other fellows, too, in case they are asleep. After that, he fell soundly asleep. These instructions were completely unnecessary, because as soon as the gigantic cart approached the pub on the Chekrylovskaya road, everyone shouted, Stop! Overko's horses must have been trained to halt before every pub. Despite a hot July day, everyone left the cart and went in a low, dirty room, where the Jewish pub-keeper happily received his old friends. The pub-keeper brought out a few pork sausages, placed them on the table, and instantly turned away from this food forbidden by Talmud. Everyone sat down at the table. Clay mugs were set before each guest. Philosopher Koma took place in the revelry. As most Ukrainians, having had a few drinks, always wanted to hug and kiss, the entire room soon filled with exclamations. Come on, spirit, give me a kiss. And over here, Dorosh, let me give you a hug. One Cossack, who was older than the others and had a grey mustache, rested his head on his hand and burst into tears from the depth of his soul, telling everyone he had no father or mother, and he was all alone in the world. Another one was a very sensible man and constantly consoled him, saying, "Don't cry. Honest to God, don't cry. There's no use crying. God knows how things have to be." The Cossack named Dorosh turned extremely curious and kept quizzing Philosopher Koma. "I want to know what they teach you at the Bursa. Is it the same stuff the deacon recites at church, or some other thing?" "Leave him be," the sensible one said. "Leave him be. God knows how it should be. God knows everything." "No, I want to know," Doris said. "What's written in those books? Maybe it's different from the deacon's books." "Oh, my goodness, my goodness," the sensible mentor said. "Why would you say such a thing? Such is God's will. If God made it so, you cannot change it." "I just want to know what they write in there. I'll go to the Bursa. Honest to God, I will. What, you think I can't learn? I'll learn everything. Everything." "Oh, my goodness," the other one said, and rested his head on the table, for he was no longer capable of holding it up. Other Cossacks discussed various landowners and what made the moon glow in the sky. Philosopher Koma, seeing such distribution of forces, decided to take his chance and sneak away. He first addressed the gray-haired Cossack mourning his father and mother. "Why do you cry, uncle?" he said. "I'm an orphan myself. Let me go, fellows. What do you need me for?" "Let's set him free," some replied. "He's an orphan, after all. Let him be on his way." "Ah, my goodness, the sensible one said, lifting his head. "Let him go. Let him be on his way." The Cossacks were just about to lead him out into the open field and let him go. But the curious one stopped them and said, "Don't. I want to talk to him about Bursa some more. I'm going to Bursa myself." In fairness, the escape was unlikely to take place, for when the philosopher tried to get up, his legs felt wooden, and he saw so many doors around the room. It was unlikely to find the real one. Only in the evening did this company remember they had to keep moving. They piled into the cart and set out, shouting at the horses and singing a song whose words and meaning could not have been sorted out. Having traveled through most of the night and lost their way constantly, despite knowing it very well, they finally rode down a steep hill into a valley, and the philosopher saw a palisade or a fence on each side, with low trees and roofs peeking from behind it. This was a large settlement belonging to the wealthy Cossack. It was well after midnight, the skies were dark, and little stars flickered here and there. There wasn't a light in a single window. They rode into the courtyard, accompanied by the barking of dogs. Straw-covered sheds and cabins stood on each side. One of the buildings standing in the middle, right across from the gate, was bigger than the others and appeared to be the owner's house. The cart halted before a shed, and our travelers went to bed. The philosopher, however, wanted to take a better look at the master's dwelling from the outside. But much as he peered into the darkness, he couldn't see anything clearly. The house corner suddenly looked like a bear. The chimney seemed to turn into the rector. The philosopher gave up and also went to bed. When the philosopher woke up, the entire house was already awake. The young mistress died during the night. The servants rushed about back and forth. Some old women wept. A crowd of curious passers-by peered over the fence, as if they could see anything of importance that way. The philosopher took some time to look at those areas he could not make out at night. The owner's house was a small, squat building of the kind often built in Ukraine. It had a straw roof. A small, tall, sharp portico with a window that looked like an eye was painted with blue and yellow flowers and red crescents. It was set atop oaken pillars, round on top and hexagonal at the bottom, with skilled carving at the very top. Under the portico was a small porch with benches on each side. On the sides of the house were awnings resting on the same sort of pillars spiraling up. A tall pear tree with a pointy top and fluttering leaves loomed green in front of the house. Several barns formed 2 rows across the yard, making a kind of street leading to the house. Beyond the barns, by the gates, were 2 triangular cellars, also covered with straw. Their triangular walls had low doors and were painted with various images, One of them portrayed a Cossack sitting atop a barrel with a mug in his hand and an inscription, "I'll drink it all." On another one were painted a flask, some bottles, an upside-down horse, a pipe, and tambourines, with an inscription, "Wine is a Cossack's joy." A drum and brass trumpets stuck out from an enormous window in the attic of one of the barns. There were 2 cannons by the gates. Everything suggested the master of the house liked to have fun, and the courtyard often heard celebratory shouts. Beyond the gates were 2 windmills. Behind the house were gardens. Dark chimney caps of the houses, hidden among the thick greenery, could be seen through the trees. The entire village was set on a wide and even mountain ledge. From the north, everything was blocked by the steep mountain, its foot ending right by the courtyard. When one looked from below, the mountain looked even taller than it was, with bedraggled weeds looming black at the top. Its clay slopes had a dull, bare appearance. It was covered with gullies and ditches from the rain. 2 houses perched up on its slope. One was overshadowed by a sprawling apple tree, propped at the roots by small sticks and piled earth. The apples, knocked down by the wind, rolled all the way into the master's yard. The road wound its way from the top and descended past the house into the village. When the philosopher considered the terrible steepness of the slope, he decided either the master had very smart horses, or the Cossacks had very strong heads, for even drunk they managed not to plummet down the mountain with the cart and all its cargo. The philosopher stood at the highest spot in the yard. When he turned and looked in the opposite direction, he saw a very different view. The village rolled down into the valley. Boundless meadows stretched far into the distance. Their bright greenery darkened toward the horizon, and entire rows of other villages were visible in the distance, although they couldn't have been less than 20 miles away. Mountains stretched on the right side of these meadows, and the Dnieper rolled its dark, sparkling waters in a barely noticeable band in the distance. "Yeah, what a nice place," the philosopher said. "I could live here, fish in the Dnieper and in the ponds, hunt sandpipers and bustards with nets or with a rifle. Although I think there are quite a few wild turkeys in these meadows. There's plenty of fruit to dry and sell in the city, or better yet, distill some vodka with them, because fruit vodka is above any grain vodka. I should really think how to get out of here." He noticed beyond the fence a small path, completely concealed by overgrown weeds. He set his foot on it, thinking of merely taking a walk, and then perhaps quietly wind his way between the houses and make for the fields. Just then he felt a fairly firm hand on his shoulder. Behind him stood the same old Cossack who grieved so bitterly over the death of his father and mother, and his own loneliness the night before. "You shouldn't think, Master Philosopher, of getting away from this village," he said. "This isn't the kind of place you can just run away from, and the roads are very well for a man on foot. You had better go see the master. He's been waiting for you for some time." "Lead the way. I'm only too happy," the philosopher said, and followed the Cossack. The master was a middle-aged man with gray mustache and an expression of dark sadness on his face. He was sitting at the table in the main room of the house, resting his head on both hands. He was about 50, but the deep sorrow on his face and his pale, ashen complexion showed the soul within has been killed and destroyed suddenly within moments, and all his former cheerfulness and bustling liveliness were gone forever. When Koma entered with the old Cossack, the master raised one hand and nodded in response to their respectful bow. Koma and the Cossack paused just past the door. "Who are you? Where are you from? And what is your business, my good man?" the master said, neither kindly nor sternly. "I'm from Abersa, philosopher Koma Brute." "Who is your father?" "I know not, noble master." "And your mother?" "I never knew my mother either. Common sense says there must have been a mother, but who she was, where from, and where she lived, I know not, honest to God." The master paused and seemed to ponder something for a minute. How did you meet my daughter?" "I haven't met her, noble master. Honest to God, I have not. I've never had any dealings with any noble young ladies in my life. I don't even mention them to keep from saying anything untoward." "Why, then, did she appoint you to read prayers, and not someone else?" The philosopher shrugged. "God knows why. Everyone knows noble people sometimes get whims even the smartest man couldn't sort out. There's even a proverb, 'Go, my fellow, as the master tells you.'" "You aren't lying to me, master philosopher, are you?" "May I be struck down on this very spot if I do." "If only she had lived a minute longer," the master said sadly, "I would have found out. Don't let anyone else read over me, father, but send to the Kiev seminary and bring the scholar Koma Brute. Have him pray for my sinful soul 3 nights straight. He knows. But what it was that you know, I didn't get to hear. She only said that, my dove, and died. You are a good man and must be known for your holy way of life and your noble deeds, and perhaps she's heard of you." "Who, me?" the philosopher said, dumbstruck with astonishment. "Holy life!" he uttered, looking at the master straight in the eye. "God bless you, master. What are you talking about? I used to go to the lady baker next door all the way up to Good Friday." "Well, there must be a reason for this. You must start right away." "I'd like to say, Your Excellency, of course any man who'd studied the Holy Writ could do this, but wouldn't it be more appropriate to invite a deacon, or at the very least the deacon's clerk? They're smart people and know how it's done, and I don't even have the voice for it. I'm a nobody, and not much to look at." "Say what you will, but I'll do anything my darling told me to, and won't spare any expense. Once you've read prayers over her 3 nights and do everything properly, I shall reward you. Or else, I won't envy the devil himself should he make me angry." These last words were said so firmly the philosopher couldn't help but get their meaning. "Follow me," said the master. They walked out into the hallway. The master opened a door into another room across from the first one. The philosopher paused for a moment to blow his nose and crossed the threshold with some inexplicable fear. The entire floor was covered in red cloth. In the corner under the icons, upon a high table covered with dark blue brocade with golden fringe and tassels, lay the body of the dead woman. Tall candles decorated with guelder rose stood at her head and her feet, their vague flickering getting lost in the light of day. The face of the deceased was blocked from him by the inconsolable father, who sat next to the body with his back to the door. The philosopher was struck by what the man said. "I do not regret, my most beloved daughter. You left this earth in the bloom of youth, not having lived out your life, leaving me in loneliness and grief. I only regret, my dove, I do not know who this enemy to have caused your death was. If only I knew who would offend you or even say something ill about you, I swear to God he would not have seen his children again if he were as old as I am, nor his father and mother if he were young, and his body would have been thrown to be torn by the birds and beasts of the steppes. But to my grief, my little wild daisy, my songbird, my darling, I shall live out the rest of my days without my joy, wiping tears falling from my old eyes, while my enemy rejoices and mocks the decrepit old man." He paused, unable to speak from grief, and dissolving into a flood of tears. The philosopher was touched by such inconsolable sadness. He coughed and made a sound as if to clear his throat. The master turned and pointed him at the spot near the head of the deceased, before a small pulpit with books on it. "I'll work off my 3 nights somehow," the philosopher thought, "and then the master will stuff both my pockets with pure gold." He walked up, cleared his throat again, and started reading, paying no attention to anything else, and not daring to look at the face of the deceased. All became quiet. He noticed the master had left. He slowly turned his head to look at the deceased, and chill ran through his veins. Before him was the most beautiful woman ever to have been born. It seemed never were the facial features set in such pronounced yet harmonious beauty. She looked alive. Her forehead, as beautiful and delicate as the snow or a cloud of silver, seemed to be in thought. Her eyebrows, as dark as night, were thin, even, proudly arched above her closed eyes, and her eyelashes rested above her cheeks, flushed with the heat of secret desires. Her lips looked like rubies and ready to smile. In them, as in all her features, he saw something terribly poignant. He felt his soul beginning to ache, as if in the midst of merriment and cheer by a lively crowd, someone started singing a song of oppression. The rubies of her lips made his blood boil. Suddenly he saw something frightfully familiar in her face. "Witch!" he screamed, looked aside, went pale, and continued reading his prayers. It was the very same witch he killed. When the sun was setting, the deceased was taken to the church. The philosopher supported the black coffin on one shoulder and felt as if it were something as cold as ice. The master walked ahead of him, his right arm under the cramped home of the deceased. The wooden church, black and overgrown with green moss, with 3 cone-shaped domes, stood lonely, almost at the very edge of the village. It was obvious no service had taken place there in a long time. There were candles burning before every icon. The coffin was placed in the middle, across from the altar. The master kissed the deceased one more time, knelt, then left with other bearers, having given an order to feed the philosopher well and take him to church after dinner. When they arrived in the kitchen, all the bearers touched the stove, as was customary for Ukrainians after having seen a dead body. The hunger the philosopher felt by that point made him forget about the deceased for a few minutes. Soon the entire staff started trickling into the kitchen. The kitchen was like a kind of club, a place where everyone living at the house and yard converged, including dogs that came wagging to the door to get bones and other scraps. No matter who was dispatched where and with what task, he always paused in the kitchen to smoke a pipe. Every single man at the house, dressed in Cossack coats, spent almost entire days there, stretched out on benches, under benches, near the stove, and anywhere else comfortable for lying down. Someone always forgot a hat there, or a whip to ward off the dogs, or something else. The most multitudinous assembly took place at dinner, when the horse herder was back after leaving the horses at the stables, and the cow herder came in after milking the cows, and everyone else who was elsewhere during the day. Even the least talkative tongues started wagging during dinner. They talked about everything: who had new pants made, what was inside earth, and who had seen a wolf. There were many lovers of fine living among these people, as was common among all Ukrainians. The philosopher sat down with everyone else in a large circle outside the kitchen door. Soon an old woman in a red kerchief appeared in the doorway, carrying in both hands a hot pot with dumplings, which she placed in the middle of the circle. Each pulled out his own wooden spoon. Those who didn't have spoons pulled out wooden sticks. As soon as everyone's jaws started moving a bit slower after satisfying the overall wolfish hunger, many got to talking. Naturally, the conversation turned toward the deceased. "Is it true," said a young shepherd with so many buttons and copper badges on his pipe sash he looked like a traveling merchant, "is it true the young mistress had dealings with the evil spirits? Not to speak bad about her." "Who, the young mistress?" Dorosh said, one of the Cossacks our philosopher met before. "She was a witch. I'd swear she was a witch." Now, Dorosh," the one who was ready to reason and console during their trip, said, "it's none of our business. Forget it. We shouldn't be talking about it." But Dorosh wasn't at all inclined to silence. Just before dinner, he and the man serving as the housekeeper snuck off to the cellar on some important business, and having checked upon 2 or 3 wine barrels, emerged exceedingly cheerful and talkative. "What do you want? You want me to be quiet?" he asked. "She rode on my shoulders. I swear to God she did, too." How about it, uncle? The young shepherd with buttons said. Is there a way to recognize a witch? No, Dorosh replied. There's no way. You can read every psalter ever written, but you won't find a way. Yes, there is a way. There is too, Dorosh. Don't say that, the former consoler and reasoner said. There's a reason God gave each person his own way. People of science say every witch has a little tail. When a woman is old, she's a witch, the gray-haired Cossack said coolly. Oh, you fools, the old woman said, even as she added fresh dumplings to the empty pot. Fat pigs is what you are. The old Cossack, whose name was Yavtuk, and last name Kovtun, had a satisfied smile on his lips, for he noticed his words touched a nerve with the old woman. The shepherd burst out into such heavy laugh as if two wrestling oxen started mooing at once. This conversation excited in the philosopher an irresistible desire and curiosity to find out more about the master's dead daughter, and so, wishing to return them to the original subject, he turned to his neighbor with these words. I wanted to ask, how come this entire assembly sitting here at dinner believes the young mistress to be a witch? Did she do harm to anyone or give someone the evil eye? A few things happened, replied one of the men with a face as smooth as a shovel. Who remembers Mikita the huntsman? Or the... What about Mikita the huntsman? The philosopher asked. Wait. I shall tell about huntsman Mikita, Dorosh said. I'll tell about Mikita, the herdsman said, because he was my cousin. I'll tell about Mikita, Spirid said. Let Spirid tell it, everyone else shouted. Spirid began. You, philosopher Koma, did not know Mikita. He was a rare man. He knew every dog better than his own brother. The current huntsman Mikola, sitting 3 paces behind me, doesn't come close to him. Of course, he knows his job well enough, but compared to Mikita, he's garbage. You're telling very well, Dorosh said, nodding his approval. Spirid continued. He noticed a rabbit faster than you could wipe tobacco from under your nose. He whistled, Hey, pirate, hey, juniper, and went off on his horse just as fast as can be. There's no way of telling who passed whom between him and the dogs. He could down a quart of vodka like it was nothing. He was a great huntsman. A short while ago, he started looking at the young mistress a lot. Whether he really fell for her or she bewitched him, but he was a lost man, worse than a wench. He turned into hell knows what. I don't even know how to say it. Very good, Dorosh said. Whenever the young mistress looked at him, he would drop the reins, call Pirate Bravko, stumbled, and did who knows what. One time, the young mistress came to the stables where he was brushing his horse. Can I, Mikita, she said, rest my foot on your back? And he, the fool, was only too happy and told her she could sit on his back if she wanted to. The young mistress raised her leg, and as soon as he saw it, round and white, he became overwhelmed with lust. The fool hunched over, held both her bare legs, and went prancing all around the field like a horse. He could not say where they went, but they returned barely alive, and he returned barely alive and faded after that. Later, people came to the stables and found in his place a handful of ashes and an empty bucket. He burned up on his own, and he was a fine huntsman, unlike any other. When Spirid finished his story, everyone went on to talk about the virtues of the former huntsman. Have you heard about Shepchika? Dorosh asked, turning to Koma. No. Yeah, they aren't teaching you anything smart at that bursa, I see. Listen, Cossack named Sheptun lives in our village. He's a good Cossack. Sure, he likes to steal or tells lies now and then, but he's a good Cossack. His house is not that far from here. One night, at the very same time, when we sat down to supper, Sheptun and his wife finished theirs and went to bed. It was summertime, and Shepchika went to sleep out in the yard, and Sheptun in the house on a bench. No, wait. Shevchika was on the bench, and Sheptun was in the yard. Shevchika was not on the bench. She was on the floor, chimed in an old woman standing by the doorway, resting her head on her hand. Dorosh looked at her, and looked down, and back at her, paused and said, "Don't make me lift your petticoat and make you regret butting in." This warning had its desired effect. The old woman kept mum and did not interrupt him again. Dorosh continued. Their 1-year-old baby lay in a cradle hanging from the ceiling in the middle of the house. I don't know if it was a boy or a girl. Shevchika settled down and then heard a dog scratching at the door and howling loud enough to wake the dead. She got scared, for women are such silly people. They get scared if you make a face at them from behind the door in the evening. Then she thought to smack the damn dog and make it stop howling. She picked up a poker and went to open the door. The moment she pushed the door just a little bit, the dog ran past her legs and straight to the baby's cradle. Shevchika saw then it wasn't the dog, but the young mistress. Had it been the young mistress the way she normally looked, it wouldn't have been too bad, but here's the thing. She was blue all over, and her eyes burned like hot coals. She grabbed the baby, bit its throat, and started drinking its blood. Shevchika screamed, "Oh, my goodness!" and ran out of the house. Then she saw the outside door was locked. She ran to the attic and sat there shaking. Stupid woman that she was. Then she saw the young mistress moving toward her. The young mistress rushed her and started biting the stupid woman. Sheptun dragged his wife from the attic, all blue and covered in bites. The next day, the stupid woman died. That's the kind of things that can happen. Even though she's from a noble family, she's still a witch. After finishing his story, Dorosh looked around with satisfaction and stuck his finger into his pipe, getting ready to stuff it with tobacco. The topic of the witch turned out to be endless. Everyone wanted his turn to tell something. Someone said the witch came right up to his door in the guise of a haystack. She stole someone's hat or pipe. She cut the braids of many girls in the village. She sucked several buckets of blood from people here and there. Finally, the entire assembly realized they'd been talking for too long, for it was night. Everyone wandered off to wherever they were going to sleep, be it in the kitchen, in a barn, or in the courtyard. "Well, Master Koma, it's time for us to go to the deceased," the old Cossack said to the philosopher, and the 4 of them, including Spirit and Dorosh, went to the church, using their whips to fight off the multitude of dogs that followed them down the street and gnawed on the whip handles. Despite having strengthened himself with a nice mug of vodka, the philosopher secretly felt a growing timidity as they approached the candlelit church. The strange stories he heard had an impact on his imagination. The gloom under the fence and between the trees was thinning as their surroundings grew barer. They finally walked past the decrepit church fence into the small yard with nary a tree growing in it. Nothing was beyond it but an empty field and dark meadows. The 3 Cossacks followed Koma up the steep stairs to the porch and walked into the church. There they left the philosopher, wished him to fulfill his duties without trouble, and locked the door, as their master ordered. The philosopher was left alone. He yawned, stretched, then blew on both his hands and looked around. The black coffin stood in the middle. Candles flickered before the dark icons. Their glow was only enough to light the iconostases in the middle of the church. The distant corners were swathed in gloom. The tall, ancient iconostases was very fragile indeed. Its filigree carving, formerly gilded, now barely gleamed with a sparkle here and there. The gilding fell away here and turned black there. The faces of the saints, darkened by time, looked on darkly. The philosopher looked around one more time. "Well," he said, "what's there to be scared of? No person can come in here. As for the dead people and demons, I have prayers I can read. They won't touch me. Nothing to it," he said. "Let's get to reading." He walked over to the pulpit and saw several bundles of candles. "That's good," the philosopher thought. "I should light the entire church, bright as day. It's too bad one can't smoke a pipe in the house of God." He started sticking the candles to every ledge, niche, and icon, sparing no effort, and soon the entire church filled with light. Only the murk above appeared thicker, and the glum faces of the saints looked even darker and more severe in their carved frames, with a smattering of gold paint. He walked up to the coffin, glanced timidly at the face of the deceased, and couldn't help but shudder and squint his eyes. Such terrible, glorious beauty. He turned and wanted to walk away, but either out of strange curiosity or following an old contradictory feeling one often experiences when scared, he couldn't stand it and glanced at her again, felt the same sensation, and looked yet again. Indeed, the dead woman's prominent beauty appeared terrifying. Perhaps she wouldn't have struck such terror into his heart had she been somewhat uglier. But there was nothing dull, dark, or dead in her features. Her face was alive, and the philosopher felt as if she was watching him with her eyes shut. He even thought he saw a tear roll from under the eyelashes of her right eye, and when it halted on her cheek, he saw clearly it was a drop of blood. He quickly walked back to the pulpit, opened a book, and started reading as loudly as he could to boost his courage. His voice thundered among the wooden church wall, long since deaf and silent. The heavy bass scattered without an echo through dead silence and sounded wild even to the reader himself. "What's there to be afraid of?" he thought to himself in the meantime. "It's not as if she can rise from her coffin, for she will be afraid of God's word. Let her be. And what sort of a Cossack am I to be scared so? So what if I had a bit too much to drink? That's why I'm seeing things. Why don't I take a pinch of tobacco? Hey, that's good tobacco. Fine tobacco. Very, very nice tobacco." All was dead silent. The coffin stood motionless. The candles poured forth a veritable flood of light. The brightly lit church in the dead of night, with its dead body and no other living soul, was frightening. Raising his voice, he started singing various tunes, trying to drown out the remains of his fear. But whenever his eyes turned toward the coffin, he couldn't help but wonder despite himself. What if she rises? The coffin did not move. If only there was a sound of some kind from some living creature, even a cricket in the corner. All he could hear was light crackling from one of the candles, or a weak clapping sound of a bit of wax falling to the floor. What if she rises? He looked up. He then gave a violent start and rubbed his eyes. Indeed, she was no longer lying, but sitting up in her coffin. He looked away, then turned his eyes back to the coffin in terror. She rose and walked across the church with her eyes closed, her arms outstretched, as if she wished to catch someone. She walked straight toward him. In a panic, he drew a circle around himself. With the effort, he started reading prayers and uttering incantations taught to him by an old monk who had seen plenty of witches and evil spirits in his day. She stood almost on the line, but it was obvious she had no power to cross it. She turned blue like a person dead several days. Koma didn't have it in him to look at her again, for she was terrifying. She snapped her teeth and opened her dead eyes. Seeing nothing, her face twisted in rage, she turned in another direction and went around, her arms reaching out, grasping at every pillar and in every corner, and trying to catch Koma. Finally, she stopped, shook her finger at him, and settled back into her coffin. The philosopher was still beside himself with fear and kept glancing at the witch's cramped dwelling. Suddenly, the coffin rose from its spot and started flying all around the church, slicing through the air with a whistle in every direction. The philosopher saw it almost over his head, but also noticed it could not touch the circle he drew. So he redoubled his effort, speaking out the incantations. The coffin crashed in the middle of the church and remained motionless. The corpse rose from it again, blue and covered with greenish rot. Just then a rooster crowed in the distance. The corpse fell back into the coffin, and the cover slammed shut. The philosopher's heart pounded, and sweat poured from his brow. Encouraged by the rooster, he quickly finished reading the pages he was expected to do. At first light, the church clerk and the old Yavtuk, who was the church treasurer, came to replace him. When he made it to his sleeping place, the philosopher couldn't sleep for a long time, but fatigue took its toll, and he slept until dinner. Once awake, he was given a quart of vodka by way of reinforcement. At dinner, he quickly became relaxed, added his own remarks on a few topics, and ate a fairly old piglet almost on his own. He did not dare, however, tell anyone about the events at the church, following a gut feeling and answering all questions with, "Yeah, there were all sorts of things." The philosopher was one of those people who felt exceedingly charitable after being fed well. He stretched out with his pipe in his teeth, gazed at everyone with uncommonly gentle eyes, and constantly spat off to the side. After dinner, the philosopher was in great spirits. He managed to walk around the entire village and meet almost everyone. He was even kicked out of 2 houses. One comely wench whacked him on the back with a shovel when he tried to check the material her blouse and skirt were made of. But as the day drew toward evening, the philosopher grew more pensive. An hour before supper, almost all the servants got together to play cards, or their own kind of bowling, where long sticks were used instead of balls, and the winner could ride on the loser's back. This game was fascinating to the spectators, for sometimes the herdsman, who was as broad as a pancake, climbed on the back of the pig shepherd, who was short, sickly, and consisted mostly of wrinkles. At other times, the herdsman was the loser, and Dorosh always said, when climbing onto his back, "What a huge ox you are." Those more sensible sat by the kitchen doorway. They looked very serious while smoking their pipes, even when the young ones laughed heartily at one of the herdsman's or spirit's jokes. Koma tried in vain to get into the fun. A dark thought was stuck in his mind like a nail. At supper, as hard as he liked to cheer up, fear flared within him, even as the darkness spread through the sky. "Come, it is time for us to go, Master Scholar," the gray-haired Cossack said, rising from his seat along with Dorosh. "Time to get to work." Once again, Koma was taken to the church, left alone, and locked in. As soon as he was by himself, fear started creeping into his soul. He once again saw the dark icons, the sparkling frames, and the familiar black coffin standing in the middle of the church amidst the ominous silence and stillness. "Well," he said, "the witch is no longer anything strange to me. It was only scary the first time. Yes, it's only a bit scary the first time, and afterward there's nothing to be scared of at all." He quickly went to the pulpit, drew a circle around himself, spoke a few incantations, and started reading loudly, determined not to look up from the book and not to pay attention to anything. He'd been reading for almost an hour when he started getting tired and hoarse. He pulled his tobacco horn from the pocket, and before he held a pinch of tobacco to his nose, he cautiously shifted his gaze toward the coffin. His heart grew chilled. The corpse was standing on the very line, her dead, greenish eyes leveled at him. The scholar shivered as cold ran down his veins. Looking back down at the book, he started reading his prayers and incantations louder, and heard the corpse gnashing her teeth and waving her arms, trying to grab him. But peeking with one eye, he saw the corpse was not reaching for where he was standing, and apparently could not see him. She started growling and saying terrible words with her dead lips. They burst out hoarsely like the bubbling of boiling tar. He did not know what they meant, but there was something frightening about them. The philosopher realized in terror she, too, was pronouncing incantations. Wind swept through the church from her words, and there was a noise as if from a multitude of flapping wings. He heard the wings beating against the glass of the church windows and the metal grates, claws scratching over metal, and some large force pounding at the door, trying to break in. His heart beat faster through all this. He shut his eyes and continued speaking incantations and prayers. Finally, something whistled in the distance. It was the shout of the rooster. The exhausted philosopher stopped and breathed in relief. Those who came to replace the philosopher found him barely alive. He was leaning against the wall and gazed with motionless, bulging eyes at the Cossacks nudging him. They almost carried him out and had to support him the entire way. When they got to the master's courtyard, he shook off and ordered a quart of vodka. Having downed it, he patted down his hair and said, "There are all sorts of scum in this world, and some things are ever so spooky." Those gathered around him in a circle looked down when they heard these words. Even a small boy, considered by all the servants lowly enough to delegate tasks to, when having to clean the stables or bring water, even this poor boy opened his mouth in astonishment. Just then a not quite middle-aged woman was passing by, her skirt wrapped around tight to show off her strong, shapely stature. She was the old cook's helper, and a terrible flirt, who always found something to pin to her kerchief, a bit of ribbon, a carnation, or even a piece of paper if there was nothing else. "Hello, Koma," she said when she saw the philosopher. "Oh, goodness, what's the matter with you?" she exclaimed, clasping her hands.
"What is it, silly woman?"
"Oh my God, your hair is white."
Yeah, she's right," Spirit said, looking at him carefully. "Indeed, you are as gray as our old Yovtuk."
Having heard this, the philosopher ran to the kitchen, where he noticed a triangular piece of a mirror stuck to the wall, dirtied by flies and surrounded by forget-me-nots, poppies, and even a garland of daisies, showing it to be intended for a well-dressed coquette. With horror, he saw the truth of what they said. Half of his hair has indeed turned white. Koma Brute hung his head and grew pensive.
"I shall go to the master," he finally said, "tell him everything and explain I don't want to read any more. Let him send me back to Kiev right away."
With these thoughts, he headed toward the main house. The master sat almost motionless in his room. The same hopeless sadness Koma saw on his face before was still on his face. His cheeks looked more hollow than before. It was clear he ate very little, or perhaps not at all. Unusual pallor lent him a kind of stony stillness. "Hello, my good fellow," he said, noticing Koma standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. "Well, how is it going? Is everything well?"
"All is well, but not so well. I've seen such devilry. It was bad enough to grab my hat and run away as fast as my feet would carry me."
"What do you mean?"
"Your daughter, master. By all means, she is, of course, of the noble blood. No one argues that, but not to upset you, and may God rest her soul."
"What about my daughter?"
"She's thrown her lot in with Satan. She's shown me such horrors of which there's no mention even in the Holy Writ."
"Read. Read. There's a reason she called upon you. My darling cared for her soul and wanted to drive away any ill intentions through prayer."
"Say what you will, master. I swear to God I can't do it."
"Read. Read," the master continued in the same pleading voice. "You have only one night left. Do your Christian duty. I shall reward you."
"I don't care for any rewards." "As you wish, master, but I won't read any more," Koma said firmly.
"Listen, philosopher," the master said, and his voice became strong and menacing. "I don't like these tricks. You might get away with them at your bursa. I'm not like that. I'll have you flogged better than your rector ever could. Do you know what a really nice leather whip is like?"
"Sure I do," the philosopher replied, lowering his voice. "Anyone knows that. They're quite intolerable in large quantities."
"Yes. Except you don't know how well my boys can flog," the man said sternly, rising to his feet, his face acquiring an imperious and savage expression, betraying his unbridled temper, pacified only for a time by grief. "First they flog you, then they'll sprinkle some vodka on you, and then flog you again. Go, go, do your job. If you don't, you won't be able to get up. If you do, 1,000 gold pieces.
Oh, what a scoundrel, the philosopher thought as he left. There's no joking around with a man like that. Just wait, my friend. I'll set it up so even you and your dogs won't be able to catch me. Como was determined to run immediately. He only waited for the hour after dinner, when all the servants usually climbed into the hay under the sheds, opened their mouth, and emitted such snoring and whistling the master's yard sounded like a factory. The time finally came. Even Yavtuk closed his eyes and stretched out in the sun. Frightened and shaking, the philosopher made his way to the garden, from where he thought it would be more convenient and less noticeable to get to the field. The garden was frightfully overgrown, and thus eminently suitable for any secret enterprise. With the exception of one path made for the master's needs, all else was hidden by sprawling cherry trees, elderberry, and burdocks, their tall stems crowned with prickly pink nubs reaching all the way to the top. Hops covered this entire colorful assembly of trees and shrubs like a net, making a kind of roof over them, spilling over the fence and falling down in coiling strands, mixing with wild bluebells. Beyond the fence, serving as the garden's boundary, was an entire forest of weeds seemingly unattended by anyone in ages. A scythe would have shattered had its blade ever touched these thick, woodsy stems. When the philosopher started climbing over the fence, his teeth chattered and his heart pounded so loudly he became frightened. The hem of his long coat seemed to have stuck to the ground, as if someone had nailed it down. When he climbed over, he thought he heard a deafening whistle and a voice crackling in his ears. Where? This philosopher snuck into the weeds and ran, constantly stumbling over gnarly roots and stepping on moles. He saw, once he was out of the weeds, he had to run across the field, with a black band of thorn bushes looming beyond, where he would be safe, and having passed it, could get to a road leading straight to Kiev. He dashed across the field and found himself in the midst of thick brush. He crawled through, leaving bits of his coat on each and every thorn by way of a toll, and ended up in a small ravine. A small spring sparkled there, as bright as silver. The philosopher lay down and drank, because he felt unbearably thirsty. Good water, that, he said, wiping his mouth. I could rest here. No, we'd better keep moving, or someone might be giving a chase. These words sounded right over his head. He looked and saw Yavtuk standing before him. Damn Yavtuk, the philosopher thought in vexation. I wish I could hang you by your legs or beat your revolting face and everything else with an oak log. You shouldn't have taken the roundabout way, Yavtuk continued. It would have been better to go the same way I did, by the stables. It's too bad about your coat. That's some fine cloth. How much did you pay for a yard? Well, it's enough dallying, though. Time to go home. The philosopher stumbled after Yavtuk, scratching his head. Now the cursed witch will be all over me, he thought. Although, what's the matter with me? What am I scared of? Am I not a Cossack? After all, I made it through 2 nights. Maybe God will see me through the 3rd. The damned witch must have sinned aplenty, since the evil spirits stand up for her like that. Such were his thoughts when he returned to the master's yard. Having encouraged himself by such consideration, he asked Dorosh, who was great friends with the housekeeper and thus had access to the master's cellars, to bring out a keg of moonshine. The 2 friends settled by the barn and consumed half a bucket, at the very least, before the philosopher suddenly rose to his feet and yelled, Musicians! I must have musicians this very minute! Without waiting for the musicians, he started dancing in the middle of the yard. He danced until it was time for lunch, and the servants, surrounding him as usual in a circle, finally gave up and went off, saying, Look at him dancing all the time. Finally, the philosopher went to sleep where he stood, and it took a bucket of cold water to wake him up for supper. At supper he talked much of what it meant being a Cossack, and how he had no right to fear anything in the world. It's time, Yavtuk said. Come along. I wish I could stick a match in your tongue, damn scoundrel, the philosopher thought, got to his feet, and said, Let's go. The philosopher kept glancing along the way, and
kept trying to chat with his companions, but Yavtuk remained silent, and even Dorosh was far from talkative. It was a hellish night. An entire pack of wolves was howling somewhere, and even the dogs barking sounded terrifying. I think something else is howling. Not a wolf, Dorosh said. Yavtuk was silent. The philosopher did not know what to say either. They came to the church and stepped under its decrepit wooden roof, betraying how little the owner of the estate cared about God and his soul. Yavtuk and Dorosh walked away as before, and the philosopher was left alone. Everything looked as he left it. All was as familiarly ominous as before. He paused for a minute. The coffin of the terrible witch stood motionless in the middle. I won't be scared. Honest to God, I won't be scared, he said, and having drawn a circle around himself, started remembering all his incantations. The silence was frightening. The candles flickered and bathed the entire church in light. The philosopher turned a page, then another one, and realized he wasn't reading what was written in the book. He made the sign of the cross and started singing. This encouraged him some. The reading moved along, and sheets flickered before him, one after another. Suddenly, in the midst of dead silence, the iron cover of the coffin cracked, and the corpse rose from it. She was even more terrifying than before. Her teeth clacked loudly against each other, her lips twitched, and her incantations poured forth with savage screeching. Whirlwind swept through the church, causing the icons to fall to the floor and showering the floor with bits of glass from broken windows. The doors flew off their hinges, and an unimaginable multitude of monsters flew into the house of God. The terrible noise from their wings and scratching of their claws filled the entire church. They all flew and dashed about, looking for the philosopher. The last of the hangover flew out of Koma's head. He kept making the sign of the cross and praying haphazardly. The entire time he heard the evil spirits flying around him, the tips of their wings and disgusting tails only just missing him. He didn't have it in him to look closer at any one of them. He saw some enormous monster standing up against the wall. Its hair was as tangled as branches in the forest. Through the hair peeked two terrible eyes, thick eyebrows raised above them. Above the monster hung a kind of enormous bubble with thousands of claws and scorpion stingers. Black soil hung from them in clumps. All of them looked right at him, looked for him, but could not see him within his mystical circle. Bring V. Go get V, the corpse said. The church suddenly became silent. A wolf howled somewhere, and soon heavy footsteps sounded in the church. With a sideways glance, Koma saw them leading in some squat, heavy, big-footed fellow. He was covered in black soil. His earth-covered arms and legs looked like strong, wiry roots. He walked heavily, stumbling all the time. His long eyelids hung all the way to the ground. Koma realized in terror the monster's face was made of iron. The others led him by his arms and placed him right across from where Koma was standing. Lift my eyelids. I cannot see, V said in a voice from the grave, and the entire host rushed to raise his eyelids. Don't look, some inner voice whispered to the philosopher. But he couldn't help himself and looked. There he is, V screamed, and pointed an iron finger at him. All of them, as many as there were, rushed at the philosopher. He crashed to the ground, and his spirit left him from terror. A rooster crowed. This was the second crow. The monsters missed the first one. The frightened demons rushed out haphazardly through windows and doors to get out as quickly as possible, but they failed and remained there, stuck halfway out. When the priest came in, he stopped at the sight of such desecration of God's sacred house, and did not dare serve Mass in a place like that. And so the church remained forever with monsters stuck in its doors and windows, became overgrown by the woods, roots, weeds, and wild thorn bushes, and no one could find a path to it anymore. When rumors about all this reached Kiev, and theologian Kalyava finally heard of Koma's fate,
He fell into thought for an entire hour. Many changes have taken place with him during that time. He'd had good luck. After finishing his studies, he was appointed a ringer at the tallest bell tower, and he almost always walked around with his nose bloodied because the wooden staircase leading up the tower was very carelessly made. "Did you hear what happened to Koma?" Tiberius Gorobets asked him. He was a philosopher by then and had a full mustache. "Such was his lot," Kalyava the ringer said. "Let's go to the club and drink to his soul." The young philosopher, who took advantage of his new privileges with such enthusiasm, his pants, his coat, and even his hat smelled of alcohol and tobacco, expressed utmost readiness. "He was a good man, Koma was," the ringer said, when the lame pub-keeper placed the third pint before him. "A fine man, and he perished for nothing." "I know why he perished. Because he got scared. Had he not been scared, the witch wouldn't have done him any harm. All he had to do was make the sign of the cross and spit on her tail, and nothing would have happened to him. I know these things. All the peasant women at the market here in Kiev are witches." The ringer nodded his agreement. But noticing his tongue could no longer speak a single word, he carefully rose from behind the table and stumbled off to hide in the most distant patch of weeds. Before he left, he remembered, following his old habit, to steal an old boot sole someone left on the bench. That's the story. Have a Merry Christmas, and thank you, Maria, for your gift to me, and this is my gift to you.